I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
Few families have had a life as public and as tumultuous as the royal family. The drama of the monarchy makes for a perfect fit on the silver screen.
The Queen hints at change but pleads for understanding.
The obsession that we have with the monarchy, the love-hate relationship we have, but whether we're pro-monarchist or anti-monarchist, everybody is obsessed one way or the other. So you knew that there'd be an enormous amount of scrutiny. Therefore, the tone of the film was incredibly important. So that's one fear. And then the next fear is, will I get it right? Will I be able to do it? I have no idea.
But there is no royal who has had as many incarnations on screen than the Queen.
Marilyn Monroe's voice, Sean Connery's voice, and I can't suddenly, some actors can do that impersonation thing. I can't do that at all. I'm hopeless.
A Queen highly noted for her charming wit, her sense of duty, her sense of being, and above all, her long and historic reign of the United Kingdom.
My goodness, I've been busy.
I fell in love with the story as soon as I read the script, and I was determined to be in the film.
The other thing that a lot of people don't know about the Queen is at one time she wanted to be an actress. Well, I suppose in a way, being Queen, you are an actress.
I think I had a very kind of Canadian approach and view of the Queen. She was really, a figurehead. And then when I did all of the research and I started to read a lot about her, I was really amazed and inspired by her, the things she had done in her life and her sense of duty and her commitment and her dedication. And it was almost like a beautiful person to discover.
With her passing, the power of film and television helped to keep her memory alive.
Do you mind, should she ever watch the film, what she thinks about it?
I mind. Yes, I do mind. Of course I mind. I'd mind if she was, as I say, a farmer's wife in Somerset or a checkout girl in Manchester whose life, for some reason, suddenly became the subject of a movie.
If you will, Mum, to cut the first slice. I did remark that it was upside down and you wouldn't be able to see what was on it. I thought it had to be upside down for the press.
They can see. I don't matter. Well, I think I can probably read it upside down, too.
I think you probably can.
When it comes to depicting the Queen, nobody does it better than Her Majesty herself.
There is a knife. I don't know whether you would like to just do a little bit.
I think I might just put a knife in it.
I think that's a really good idea.
See if it works. Oh, yes, it is.
Does.
Beautifully.
Beautifully.
Somebody else can
finish it off.
Do the rest of it.
Well done.
Queen Elizabeth has made many television appearances. More recently, the Queen has made a television broadcast in 2022 during her Platinum celebration. Her humour is most visible here, when Paddington Bear joins Her Majesty for afternoon tea. They shared one thing in common, their love for a marmalade sandwich. It was a laugh to the millions of viewers watching when she revealed what is kept in her handbag.
Oh dear. Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Oh.
For later.
The other thing that a lot of people don't know about the Queen is at one time she wanted to be an actress. So forget Margaret being the great actress and singer. I mean, the Queen could sing, play the piano, and is a brilliant mimic. Well, I suppose in a way, being Queen, you are an actress. So when the Paddington Bear idea was mooted, she was thrilled to do it. And she was very professional because, I mean, there was just her acting against nothing. And they asked her, you know, what kind of sandwich she'd like in her handbag. And she said, well, no, I don't want one with the crust cut off. I want a proper, big marmalade sandwich. It was wonderful, and she did it with great humour. And I think it really, really endeared her to the younger people as well as her older subjects. And I understand that there were over 1,000 Paddington Bears left around and about London and all over the country.
But no television broadcast is able to beat the London 2012 Summer Olympics opening ceremony. The Queen holds an audience with James Bond, played by Daniel Craig. She makes a jaw-dropping opening ceremony that wowed the many viewers watching. James Bond escorts her via helicopter to the Olympic Stadium, and stuntman Gary Connery doubled as Elizabeth for a parachute jump into the ceremony. This was watched worldwide and had many people massively excited and scared for the Queen. It became talk of the town and was an iconic moment that had many people shaken and stirred in the best way possible. Many of us wouldn't be able to face our fear of heights, but the Queen does it rather dazzlingly.
His brother became George VI and had 2 daughters, with Elizabeth destined to become queen. 25 years ago, she was a carefree little girl, Princess Lilibet. Her uncle became the Duke of Windsor after his marriage, but his wife was never accepted in royal circles and was never granted a title.
Queen Elizabeth II was only the age of 25 when she became queen. However, as a young child, she was everything but aware of her life ahead. When she was born in 1926, she and her family did not expect that she would one day become queen. But everything changed in December 1936, when her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated, making her father, George VI, king, and his daughter Elizabeth next in line to the throne.
Personally, I think he is a sign of modern democratic times. I do not think that the Church should interfere in matters of state.
I am a chauffeur by profession. After all, the king is a man like myself, but he should not allow his private life to interfere with his public life.
Elizabeth was only 10.
George VI, when he was a younger man, was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, the Queen, and to their children Elizabeth and Margaret. He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life.
I don't believe that Princess Elizabeth was really aware of what it meant when her Uncle David, she called him, abdicated. She knew something had happened because everyone was in a terrible state, and she knew eventually that they would have to move house, and she knew that her father would be king and her mother would be queen, but I don't think the actual real sort of dimensions of her situation, she was too young to understand that.
George VI, or Bertie as he was known, was absolutely terrified at the idea of becoming king. It was something he'd never wanted. He had a debilitating stammer, which meant that any kind of public speaking was nearly impossible for him. And it was with complete fear that he watched the rise of the abdication crisis, because he did not want to be king. He wanted to have a quiet, blameless life as a husband, a father, somebody who was a royal prince who stammered his way through speeches he had to give, but he never, ever wanted responsibility of actually ruling. And so he was looking at his brother and begging him not to abdicate, but Edward wasn't interested because his attitude was very bluff. It was to pat his brother on the back and say, "Never mind, old man, you'll do this much better than I ever did." So when he became king, it was with an almost impossible set of expectations. How on earth do you follow somebody who has not just been this popular, trend-setting figure, But he was given up before and abdicated. I mean, how do you follow that?
George knew that his life was short. He had a stammer, was a heavy smoker, and the stress of the war had taken a huge toll on his well-being. He was unconfident and was afraid of public speaking. He was growing increasingly ill, and it was only a matter of time until his daughter would one day have to step into his shoes.
In 1936, Bertie unexpectedly becomes king. This was a moment of great challenge for him in that he was something of a reluctant figure. He had been up until this point a family man. He enjoyed his private home life away from the media, away from the cameras. He knew from this point forward that this would all become and be put on public show, and that he'd had to embrace a new path that required that he put duty and public service ahead of all else.
Bertie had suffered from a stammer from childhood, but it was massively worse and exacerbated by his responsibilities when he reached adulthood, because he would have to give speeches. And he hated it. He hated it because he felt completely ill-equipped to do so. And he would actively try and avoid opportunities of doing so because he felt embarrassed. The problem is that what he realised, especially when his father was alive, was that you can't duck these responsibilities. And so he had these horrendously embarrassing experiences that he would go and address for kind of low-grade events that you needed a member of a royal family to be at. And he'd often find himself making noise rather than a conventional speech, which is why he needed to have a speech therapist who could actually help him.
In 1926, Bertie engaged the expertise of a speech therapist, the Australian Lionel Logue. Logue was seen as something of a quack at the time by the medical profession in that he did things differently. He didn't have the credentials of normal doctors, but nevertheless, with his unconventional methods, he managed to get Bertie going in terms of making public addresses. Bertie would practice day in, day out, for at least an hour on strengthening his muscles around his vocal cords in order to try and gain a greater sense of confidence and control over his voice.
The speech therapist that he hired, or rather was hired for him by his wife, was this man called Lionel Logue, who was not Australian. And Logue was very unconventional because he didn't believe that the way of dealing with speech therapy was to be formal about it. He dealt with the king, who he called Bertie informally, as if they were friends, as if they were working on the same level. And the film The King's Speech offered a fictionalised account of this, and it's broadly accurate in what it suggests, that there was this friendship that arose between them. I mean, where the film sentimentalises matters is that George was afflicted by the stammer all his life and never went away. I mean, he was able at a push to do speeches without obvious sounds of impediment, but he needed speech therapy. He needed to be given, he needed to be bucked up, in other words, before he could actually do what he needed to do.
My husband is, he's required to speak publicly.
I have received...
Perhaps he should change jobs. He can't. And what of my husband with the Duke of York?
Forgive me, Your
Royal Highness.
He said it's all-consuming. It's basically all you think about. It's not just something that interferes with certain events or certain occasions. He basically wouldn't answer the phone with hello because he couldn't use the H. He wouldn't order fish in the restaurant because he couldn't say F, even though he wanted the fish, so he'd order the beef. If you have a meeting, you're less focused on the actual outcome of the meeting. You're more focused on whether you're going to be able to say your first sentence.
And how do you think, the way that you understand the character, how do you think that the stammer affected the king's self-esteem and sense of self-worth?
I think it had a terrible effect on it. He was always described, frequently described as excessively shy, very retiring, very nervous, resistant to appearing in public at all. It has to be connected. And the nightmare of stepping up to the job of king, especially in that one interval in history when the live microphone is so important. And that really is his main job description. Generation earlier, it wouldn't have been an issue. Generation later, it could have been edited, it could have been recorded. This was live to the nation and to 58 countries that were then in the British Empire, whatever it was. And it was the perfect storm of disasters for this man.
In 1914, the call came. The trial was made.
The speech therapy was very effective for Bertie in that he did gain in confidence. Notably, the impediment would never fully go away. Bertie would continue to stammer, even on becoming king. It was notable in many of his recorded broadcasts that his speech was marked by pauses and some stammering. But nevertheless, he became a much more confident and competent public speaker than he had been before.
What kept Elizabeth strong during these premature years was the bond between her and her father. It truly was one of a kind. She had an extremely loving childhood, and George had made sure to prepare his daughter in the role of a monarch as she was growing up.
George's relationship with his daughters is a very good one. He had a deep affection for both Elizabeth and Margaret. He was a family-orientated man who took great pleasure in watching them grow up and ensuring their development. He also saw them as the future of the monarchy, so they therefore received a training in what it was to be young members of the British royal family from him and his wife. He had great expectations for both of them.
Bertie had a particular passion for Margaret. It was always said that Elizabeth was his pride and Margaret was his joy.
Princess Elizabeth was very close to her father, always was. I mean, he absolutely adored Margot, Princess Margaret, and Margaret made him laugh, but he was very proud of Elizabeth. And he saw that sense of duty. He spotted it very early on, and he knew that she would be just the sort of queen that the country needed.
George had been preparing Elizabeth to one day succeed him as the British monarch and as head of Commonwealth. The way he'd done this is to essentially demonstrate to her what the role of monarch required and also give her opportunities to begin to develop her own public role. For example, her position in the ATS at the end of the Second World War was a way that she embraced a new public role, demonstrating that she was committed to service and duty. She would accompany her parents on tours during the immediate post-war years, where she went out and was learning, if you like, the ropes of how to be young and royal.
If you're the heir to the monarch, there's always a sense of preparation to become king or queen. And from the moment Bertie became king, Elizabeth was queen in training.
The coronation of King George VI was a teaching moment for Elizabeth. Painfully aware of how ill-prepared he was for his coronation, he wanted things to be different for Elizabeth when she would ascend to the throne. He gave her a writing assignment in connection to his coronation and hoped that this would become an indelible memory so that she could draw upon that for strength when her time eventually came. He'd take her out on an equal par with her sister Margaret, and this may well have contributed to the grace and humility with which Queen Elizabeth has become known for when carrying out her duties. He had refocused Elizabeth's studies to be one that better prepares her for her reign. George had involved Elizabeth massively in his reign early on, leaving her to take on duties from him whilst he was away. The King's Speech, released in 2010, tells the story of Queen Elizabeth's father, King George VI, and how he coped with his stammer. Elizabeth, played by Wilson, made an appearance in the film, portraying her as a blissful young child, unaware of her future. Wilson's curly hair and ruffled outfit created an accurate portrayal of the future queen.
Your Majesty.
She played Elizabeth impeccably and reflected upon her loving nature to her father, often depicting her as someone who is both light-hearted and someone who is ready to speak her mind. There were a lot of intimate yet sad scenes from the film where Elizabeth feels for her father struggling to speak, but at this tender age, she just didn't know what this meant.
I'm not a king. I'm a naval officer. The nation believes that when I speak for them, and I can't speak. Why should I waste my time listening? Because I have a voice! Yes, you do.
She did a great job in making the viewers feel as if they're in the room with her, and we really feel a sense of gratitude when it comes to the story of her father. A lot of Elizabeth's upbringing was affected by the Second World War, which came to an end in 1945. During this period, George and his wife were concerned for their children's safety, and they were therefore kept away from their parents to a place much safer.
At the start of the war, there was a real concern at the palace that the British monarchy didn't really have a role to play. That it could offer leadership by visiting troops, for example, but that it didn't really have a stage to perform on, as had been the case during the First World War. Then in the summer of 1940, as the bombing raids on London begin and the German Luftwaffe is blitzing people's homes, factories, and other towns and cities across the country, this, if you like, is the great opportunity for the British royal family, because suddenly they have a role to play. They go out visiting members of the public who have been bombed out of their homes, who have been working through the night to help those who are suffering as a result of the air raids. They are there to provide reassurance to the public, to recognise the hard work and effort that is going in to fighting this war on the home front. So it's a different kind of leadership to the wars of before, in that George and his wife Elizabeth's roles were much more focused on Britain and the home front. The young princesses also had an important public relations role to play during the Second World War. Their whereabouts were kept hidden, mainly out of concern for their safety, and it was initially rumoured that they might be taken to Canada to be put out of harm's way. But instead, there was great emphasis placed publicly on the fact that they remained in Britain, but were separated from their parents, so that they, if you like, symbolised the experience of evacuation, separation from their parents, members of their family. In that respect, they were upheld as symbols of the war experience, symbolic of their generation. In fact, we know now that they spent most of the war at Windsor Castle. Most evenings they were reunited with their mother and father who returned there. But in terms of the public narrative, in terms of what ordinary people read and knew about, they were separated from their family. Elizabeth joined the ATS, which saw her embark on military service for the first time. She was there essentially as a mechanic, an army mechanic. The press and newsreel images that we see of her from this period show her driving around in army lorries, looking at and inspecting engines. The emphasis clearly here was again on the princess doing her bit, demonstrating that, like other women of her age, she was ready to do her service in order to ensure that the war was won.
Princess in overalls. On her 19th birthday, the heiress presumptive to England's throne learns a few facts about tires and carburetors. Elizabeth is in the ATS, or British WAC, and at the King's request, is being treated just like any other trainee. Now, visited by her parents and sister Margaret Rose at a training station in southern England, she shows them she knows a fan belt from a spark plug all right, and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Her father gave her an officer's commission early in March. Papa and Mama seem to approve, too.
Daughter is the first woman member of the royal family to join the services full-time. The young princess, who's never set foot in a London bus and was only once in the subway, now drives a truck for the Red Cross. And, come to think of it, can you name a better way for a princess to spend her birthday?
The King and Queen were very keen to emphasise a narrative that they, the royals, and the British public at large were all in this war together. There was a sense of shared sacrifice that united crown and people.
Of the 500 German planes that came over that day, more than 1/3 were shot down.
In the 28 days of terror from September 7th to October 5th, the Nazis dropped 50 million pounds of bombs on the city, killed 7,000 helpless civilians, and wounded 10,000 more. Bombs fell on Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, Fleet Street, the center of the news, St. Paul's Cathedral. Bombs blasting the historic past out of the lives of Englishmen.
After the palace was bombed, they're both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very, very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, "I look outside and I can't forget seeing the bomb."
I think that the King and Queen saw the bombing of Buckingham Palace really as an important public relations opportunity, using it to demonstrate that the royals were on the front line like their people, that they were suffering from the war along with the British public. Cameramen, journalists were invited into Buckingham Palace to survey the damage, to photograph it, and images emerged on the front page of newspapers of the king in amongst the rubble, in amongst the debris of Buckingham Palace, demonstrating that the king, he was also affected by what was going on.
Of course, when World War II broke out and London was bombed and the royal family did not leave Buckingham Palace and everyone saw that the palace had been bombed and they went to visit the East End, that was incredibly clever and also incredibly soothing for the British public. So it stopped that them and us divide. Suddenly it's not them and us, it's they are one of us. And George grew into his role as his popularity was cemented at this time.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
Unconditional surrender. Victory over our last enemy, Japan.
Our future queen was only the age of 19 when the war ended, and the end of the war called for the start of a celebration.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. She has inflicted upon Great Britain, the United States and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Sarah Gadon played a teenage Princess Elizabeth in A Royal Night Out. It is based on the true story of when the princess covertly partied with commoners the night World War II ended. Not much is known of what exactly happened that night, but it is a small fantasy inspired by that true story. In 1945, she and her sister, Princess Margaret, went incognito to mix in with the crowds and experience first-hand joy alongside the people who were celebrating all over London. This day was famously known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. We see her close relationship with her sister Margaret, making that family bond a tight knot. The goal with this film was to exhibit well-known characters. It needed the actors to exist in the heightened fantasy environment of the film while remaining completely anchored in reality. Sarah also resembled Princess Elizabeth, who was a truck mechanic and driver for the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, a women's branch of the British Army.
Thing is, what? My sister and I have been brought up to believe in the importance of sincerity.
Everyone, this is hard enough as it is.
Fairness, too. And for 6 years now, we've been positively cloistered. Like nuns.
We understood the reference.
Margaret and I deserve the right to celebrate, too. Outside. I agree with her completely.
I'm sure you do. No, we can't do that. Besides, what's so special about going...
I don't know, and I never will unless we go out tonight.
The celebrations for VE Day were long in the planning. For literally months, the British government had been corresponding with the palace, thinking about and working out how they were going to stage this moment of celebration. The day itself unfolded as a day of great jubilation, of great relief. The centerpiece of the day in terms of royal photography was the moment when Winston Churchill, as, if you like, successful war leader and prime minister, joined the royal war leader, George VI and George VI's family on the palace balcony to be cheered by the crowds that gathered below.
We give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome.
The king spoke about the sacrifice that ordinary members of the public had made, that sacrifice had been worth it, in that the war had been won, fascism had been beaten, and that democracy would now prevail.
Sarah is known to have some qualities of the young Elizabeth, especially in her sense of duty, steadfastness, and wit. The film takes on many parts of its visual and tonal cues from the screwball movies of the 1940s.
Captain Price and Lieutenant Burridge will be your chaperones.
Chaperones?
They will escort you to the Brits and stay with you all night long. Hey!
Time for a quickie, surely, sir. 2, please.
Come on, Lilibet! Margaret! How do I stop the bus?
Push that.
Lizzie.
Jack, where now? Chelsea Barracks?
Trafalgar Square. Soho.
You know, has it made you appreciate the royal family, maybe? I don't know if you were a fan before, or has it made you appreciate the Queen, certainly?
Absolutely. I learned so much about them in my research, and I think especially of Elizabeth. She was such a unique woman, ahead of her time, and she faced, you know, so many challenges throughout her life and endured them with such grace and elegance and poise, and that was a real inspiration for me. I always think that's the most exciting part about transforming into different people and playing different characters, is becoming them physically and what that takes, and it really is a huge part of the character and a part of the performance. And so when I put my ATS uniform on and I had my brown hair, the hairstyle, and you know, the posture and the walk and all of those things together for our camera tests, I really felt like we were approaching something. We were approaching it. So that was really cool.
George VI, who had, as a young man, often suffered from ill health, became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor. In the ensuing years, that health would deteriorate. A number of smoking-related diseases would afflict the king to the extent where he would ultimately die prematurely in 1952.
I think it's fair to say that the two things that destroyed George's health and led him to an early death were first of all his becoming king at all, and secondly the sheer stress of what he had to do in World War II, because if a war had never happened, if a peace had been sought with Hitler that had then been agreed, he may have lived longer, but he was faced with the most horrendous stress and pressure.
Against doctor's orders, he travelled to the airport in January 1952 to say farewell to his daughter Elizabeth and Philip before they left for their tour of East Africa. It would be the last time that he saw his daughter.
Princess Elizabeth's father died 7 years after the end of World War II. She was 25 when her father died, leaving her to become queen.
It was an enormous shock for Elizabeth. I mean, she hadn't expected her father to die. She was on a trip at the time, and of course she would never have gone on a trip if she'd thought there was any serious danger of her father dying. And of course, you don't want to sentimentalise these things because you don't want to make it look as if it's, you know, a heartbroken queen. But she was a relatively young woman, recently married, and she lost her father. And in addition to personal loss, she knew she was going to have to become queen. I think that was an incredible moment because you know at that stage that you've got to change your entire life and you'll never have your own life again.
There was a real sense of shock when George VI died, not least because he was still such a young man, only in his 50s. The king had not started off as a very popular figure when he came to the throne in late 1936, but nevertheless, he was associated with the war effort. He had demonstrated that he was dutiful, that he was diligent, and through that, he had earned their loyalty and affection.
When Princess Elizabeth received the news of the death of her father, she went into shock, as you would. I mean, she was shocked by his death because she thought he was getting better. Everybody within the family thought the king was getting better. He was at Sandringham, he'd been out shooting, he'd had a wonderful day, he was with friends, and as Princess Margaret said much later in an interview, he died just as he was getting well. But of course he wasn't really getting well, they thought he was. So it was a huge shock to her. And it meant the end of her life as she knew it. She had 2 little children, a naval husband. They just started out, really, on their married life. And they just moved into Clarence House, which was their first real home. And then he was going to be posted to Malta. Their life looked really rosy, and suddenly, basically, it ended.
Her coronation took place in 1953.
The coronation of the Queen was a huge and very significant affair. It was a 3-hour ceremony. It was, everybody recalls, the coldest June day that had ever happened. And it was pouring with rain. The army was enormous. Every sort of foot or 2 feet along the pavement, there was what they call street liners, which were soldiers. And they were all really cold, and they were given sugar lumps infused with brandy to sort of keep them going. And the ceremony itself was very, very serious and very religious and very dramatic. We won't ever have a ceremony quite like that again. She was very, very shy. She wasn't a great conversationalist. In fact, she didn't really have the necessary attributes to enter this world of men, but she had this extraordinary dedication to duty. She was determined that she was going to do it right, and she had no training. She just did what her father did. And that kind of, in a way, suited her character because she could learn as she went along, but without doing anything extraordinary. So she just did dutifully, really, what she was told most of her life. And I think it was really only in her latter years that we saw the essence of the Queen's character. We saw her humour, we saw her laughter, we saw her acerbic wit. It was always there, but she belonged to an era where public persona had to be completely straight. So we never saw that side of her, so we assumed that she was very dull and boring. But she wasn't, but she was very shy, and it had been drilled into her that you mustn't show emotion in public.
The Crown is a famous Netflix series depicting the early parts of the Queen's reign. Claire Foy played the Queen in seasons 1 and 2, from when she was just a princess through to her early years on the throne. The first season saw everything from taking in the death of her father, her ascension to the throne, her relationship with Philip, and giving birth to her first son, Charles. We also see some political tension in this season, such as the resignation of Winston Churchill. We learn a lot about the Queen's life, and Claire Foy portrays Elizabeth with such high integrity.
No, sir, if you don't mind, the Crown takes precedence.
You don't think I would have preferred to grow up out of the spotlight? Away from the scrutiny and the visibility?
Be firm, just lay down the law. I know he's Winston Churchill and all that, but remember who you are. You're
Nobody.
The Queen of England.
This new Elizabethan age comes at a time when mankind stands on the edge of catastrophe.
Season 2 covered the Suez Crisis in 1956, the retirement of the Queen's third Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in 1963, and the births of her 2 youngest children, Prince Andrew in 1960 and Prince Edward in 1964.
I've been Queen barely 10 years. And in that time, I've had 3 Prime Ministers. Not one has lasted the course.
I understand the Prime Minister's resignation
It's
and all
not
that.
just the Prime Minister.
And your mother, and your sister, and the country. The whole relentlessness of it all.
Due to characters' ages changing across the seasons, Foy had to be replaced, but was replaced by another impeccable figure of the Queen, Olivia Colman. She depicted the Queen in her mid-30s to early 60s. The Queen's life remained sharp, and Colman does a fantastic job portraying the political affairs with the Prime Ministers of the Queen. We also see the remarkable representation of the Silver Jubilee of Elizabeth. Season 3 was largely focused on events of the Queen's life from 1964 to 1977, whilst Season 4 covers the time period from 1979 and 1990. The Queen's first son, Charles, is introduced in Season 4, and we see the bond distinguished between the Queen and her son.
Presented Prince Charlie to the world. He was the first baby born to a British heir presumptive in 1,000 years.
We also see Diana introduced in this season, the Queen's daughter-in-law-to-be. But sadly, this relationship is not one with a happy ending. The marital difficulties are seen between the couple, and the effects of this are seen to hurt the Queen.
Well, I used to say that Diana was a high school dropout and Charles was a university lecturer. They were so different, and obviously that can work very well, but she was very, very young, and she'd had no experience of life. And although she'd lived on the Sandringham estate and knew the royal family, she didn't really know the royal family. She didn't really know what it would be like. She had this vision of Charles, which wasn't really him at all. And then she started to find Charles very dull. And he found her stupid. I mean, she had a very quick wit, but she wasn't well-read. She wasn't really educated. And Charles was highly educated. And all his friends were much, much older. So he started to dump his friends. And Diana's friends were all much, much younger. And so they started to lead separate lives very, very early on. What happened with the Queen was that she sat on the fence, hoping it was all going to get better, which I think is probably what you would do. That's the normal reaction of a mother. You don't want to interfere. Then Prince Philip was saying, Lilibet, you've got to do something. And so he was egging her on, and she was pulling back, because you don't want to interfere in other people's lives. So the Queen used to find this really difficult.
The Queen is not known to talk about her feelings, unless it's to Prince Philip. Olivia Colman is to have said that she didn't know too much about the Queen, and she found this role quite hard to play, as we don't know what she's like behind closed doors. She's always been someone who keeps how she feels buried inside, and this goes all the way back to World War II, when she was away from her parents. However, it's safe to say that Olivia Colman portrayed the Queen amazingly during these 2 seasons. Her lack of accuracy of the Queen's feelings actually made her a natural replicate of the Queen.
Well, I think the Queen coped with those difficult moments like most people. She had a large drink and said, well, I've got to get through with this. She very rarely confided in anybody. She was a very complete person. The only person that she would have confided in was Prince Philip. You know, he used to say, now come on, Lily, but we've got to do something about Diana. You can't get off the fence, you've got to do something. But the Queen was very reluctant, because she's very unconfrontational, like her mother, actually. She's not born of the era when you actually talk about your feelings.
How many times can this family make the same mistake? I am the sun and air, paying the consequences each time. Of nothing in particular.
All I want is to be loved. It's all any of us want from you.
Seasons 5 and 6 were replaced by Imelda Staunton. They depicted events from 1990 to 2003. We saw the downfall of Prince Charles and Princess Diana's marriage in this season, and then the romance between Charles's son William and his university classmate Kate Middleton. Imelda Staunton is proved to be the definitive version of Queen Elizabeth II. Foy and Coleman had to base their performances on archive footage, but Staunton faced the challenge of playing the version of the Queen that a majority of the audience was familiar with from decades of news coverage. The Queen really wanted the marriage of her children to prove long-lasting, but in not doing so, had made the public eyes gravitate towards her in 1992, the year she famously described as Annus Horribilis.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. I suspect that I'm not alone in thinking it so.
The royal family is in genuine crisis.
Have royal scandals damaged the country's reputation?
The House of Windsor should be binding the nation together, setting an example of idealized family life. It's a situation that cannot help but affect the stability of the country.
For years, I've called for a more modern monarchy that reflects the world outside.
I don't think it's my behavior that's threatening its survival.
Staunton played Elizabeth as this reserved, quiet, heartfelt person, whose contemplative performance is the most nuanced depiction thus far. The other Elizabeth portrayals dealt with the challenge of their nation's sins. Staunton's Elizabeth had to face the consequences of her own actions. Following the Queen's death at the age of 96, Season 1 of The Crown entered Netflix's category of Top 10. The series moved to 7th position for TV shows in the English language, with nearly 17.6 million hours viewed globally.
She wasn't well before the Jubilee. She was having a lot of problems with mobility. And the trouble with her mobility was that I think she was in great pain. And some days it was better than others. So some days she could walk forward, some days she could walk forward and a bit down, and other days she couldn't move. So she was very stoic, and I think that was her big worry, because she knew. She said to her ladies-in-waiting, I'm not going to be able to walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. I'm just not going to be able to do it. I think that the Jubilee was actually quite a trial for her. And she put on a brave face. But when she was standing on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, you could tell that it was difficult for her. And I think she couldn't have done it better.
Another woman who played the Queen remarkably well is Helen Mirren. Helen Mirren first took on the role of the legendary monarch in the 2006 film The Queen. This film followed Queen Elizabeth II in the aftermath of Princess Diana's death in 1997. And it may well have been the first film to bring Queen Elizabeth II to life on screen.
We are getting reports that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been badly injured in a car crash in France. French radio is saying that the accident happened in western Paris when the car she was traveling in collided with another vehicle in a tunnel. The princess is reported to have been taken to hospital.
Nearly there, communications with Paris falling down, but just to confirm the news that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car accident in Paris, which also killed her companion, Dodi Fayed.
There's no dispute the photographers were pursuing the Princess of Wales car on Saturday night. The key questions still being asked are how close were they at the time of the accident? Did they cause the driver to lose control?
At the scene, police impounded the motorbikes of paparazzi photographers allegedly pursuing the princess's car in a high-speed chase. 7 men were arrested.
A post-mortem has shown that Henry Paul was 3 times over the legal alcohol limit, the equivalent of drinking 8 glasses of wine or more. He was not a professional driver, but the deputy head of security at the Ritz Hotel.
In their first official announcement, detectives investigating Saturday's fatal crash have said the driver of the limousine in which the Princess of Wales and Dodi Fayed were travelling had been drinking that night. The amount of alcohol in his blood well above the legal limit.
Queen Elizabeth had given a speech shortly after the death of her daughter-in-law. She appeared nervous, and while paying tribute to the princess, she hinted at the public anger at her silence and stoicism.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
Helen recreates this event, transforming her into a queen naturally after the wig and glasses. She shared a default facial expression, a slightly downturned mouth, with the monarch. She regularly reviewed film and video footage of Elizabeth and kept photographs of her during production. She undertook extensive voice coaching, reproducing the Queen's delivery of her televised speech to the world.
Questions are being asked about why the Queen hasn't addressed her subjects at this time of national grief.
The Prime Minister for you, ma'am.
You've seen today's papers. 70% of people believe that your actions have damaged the monarchy.
Who does he think he's talking to?
Can you imagine I'm going to drop everything and come down to London before I attend to my grandchildren? And you're mistaken.
Try and see it from her perspective. She's been brought up to believe it's God's will. She is who she is.
seems to me that it must have been a particular challenge portraying somebody who we know so much about in their public persona, who everybody sees all the time, but who we know so little about in private.
Absolutely right. That's the great, it's the most extraordinary thing, isn't it? That she's utterly familiar, like Big Ben, you know. You drive past Big Ben, oh, there, Big Ben, you know that. You know, could draw it, you know, clock. But we don't know her at all. She's really a complete enigma. So, you know, my job was like a sort of private, like a detective. My job was to extricate the woman from the role and then put the two together again, because also she is the monarch, and therefore that has completely coloured, influenced and controlled her life.
Feel like you had a responsibility to be fair to her?
Absolutely. Fair above all. Fair and honest. And trying not to tip in either direction. Maybe tipping into sycophancy is more dangerous than tipping into satire or attack. But trying desperately to find the truth, the truthful way down the middle. I tried really hard to be as honest and truthful as I could, because I did feel that responsibility.
It really struck me that you've got not only the voice, but also the way she walks as well. How did
Yes.
you go about doing that?
I watched film a lot. And she walked like that even when she was a little girl. So it's intrinsic to her genetic makeup. And I love that funny little walk she's got.
Her performance of the Queen was so convincing that crew members who were previously accustomed to sloshing or relaxing when they addressed her were now standing upright and respectfully folding their hands behind their backs. She even arranged to meet up with other cast members off camera so that they would be as comfortable with each other as a real family. She was so good at capturing Queen Elizabeth in The Queen that she was asked to play her on stage in The Audience, a play that premiered on London's West End and made its way to Broadway. The play had a long stretch of Elizabeth's 70-year reign, depicting her imagined meetings with prime ministers from Winston Churchill to David Cameron. These meetings have never been recorded, and their content is unknown. It was the performance from Helen Mirren which shed a light on the Queen's real humour. We see her to have these intimate yet explosive conversations, all while she remains constant, waiting to welcome her next Prime Minister.
So, you are about to embark upon playing Her Majesty again. Was that...
Well, I've already embarked, actually. The ship has actually left the shore.
How's it feeling so far?
It's always a challenge. It's intimidating.
Let's take it back a few months when you were approached to play the role. What was your reaction when Peter Morgan came up with this idea?
I emailed him back, "You bastard." Just that was all I said, "You bastard." And he knew exactly what I meant, because he knew that I would not be able ultimately to say no, although I was very determined to say no for quite some time. Well, because, you know, obviously doing the film was such a success and it gained such attention. As an actor, you want to go forward. You don't want to be sort of particularly identified with a role, especially this is not a role. This is a human being and a part of British history, and so it's all the more sort of powerful as an image, as a memory, and you don't want to be necessarily identified with something like that. As an actor, your whole job is to sort of do lots of different things, hopefully.
No, how did you do that?
It's a red button here, ma'am.
There is no red button.
Well, it disappears when you touch it.
What?
Nice.
What?
The new Samsung.
No. Oh, I begged them not to give me one, but security persuaded me it would double as a useful tracking device. In case I ever try to escape.
I found myself, obviously I had to play her, so my inclination was that way already, but I found myself falling in love with her. And I did kind of fall in love with her. Having to think so deeply about what her life has been so incredibly spoiled in many ways, beyond anything that any of us can comprehend, and yet completely deprived. And someone who's tough and strong and hands-on and, you know, is capable of walking across the moors in her good walking boots and shoes. I'm like a portrait painter. The Queen has been painted by many different artists. This present Queen has been very free with allowing portrait painters to see what they will, and sometimes she comes out looking great, and sometimes she comes out looking hideous, and people say, how could you insult the Queen with that appalling portrait? But it's the painter's view, and I saw myself, and I do, just as another portrait painter. It's my portrait, and it's infused with my sensibility and my thought and my imagination as much as the reality of what she is.
The Queen is known to care about the public. The film Walking the Dogs in 2012 depicts a real story of a Buckingham Palace break-in in 1982. Done by an out-of-work man, where an intruder sneaks into the Queen's room for a chat while the security guard is taking the corgis for a walk. This role of the Queen is played by Emma Thompson, and she does an amazing job, having mastered the Queen's facial expressions. Her performance is very elegant, to the point in which she looks like a noble woman. This TV drama is very intimate. They talk about love, life, freedom and family before the police take the man away. It was a peaceful dialogue portraying the Queen as this friendly, thoughtful Queen, which makes the scene completely still, as if it was suspended in the void.
You can't force someone to love you. Can you?
But you can remind them of love they once felt. I don't mean literally, but in your demeanor. Patience and loyalty play their part. You can remain loyal to your deepest feelings even while your spouse cannot.
I think that if King George's spirit had been watching for Platinum Jubilee celebrations, he would have looked at it, he would have found some of it quite surprising, some of it rather strange. But I think generally, first of all, he would have enjoyed them. Secondly, he would have looked at his daughter and what she's achieved in the last 70 years, and he would have thought, I'm very glad to see what she's done.
When we think of George VI now, we think of a king who put duty and service ahead of all else.
I think that the greatest legacy of King George VI is actually his daughter. She's always reigned very much as her father's daughter. She's reigned as somebody who has prized constancy, stability, good humour, an ability to connect with people in a way that they've always found reassuring, and also a sense that monarchy has to be something of a continuation. This is how you conduct yourself. This is how the royal family has to behave. And we see his influence every day today.
Queen Elizabeth spent her whole life trying to be this notable, notorious figure that has nothing but her country at the very forefront of her mind. She became the longest reigning monarch in British history, and with her passing, it's only natural to want her charming wit and loving memory to stay with us throughout time.
I think what has defined the Elizabethan era is it took us from the ravages of war to this extraordinary world in which we live in now. So it actually defines the era of the greatest change the world has ever known.
These depictions of the Queen almost accurately resemble her, from her remarkable sense of humour to her honourable sense of duty. Elizabeth continues to shine.
Was it daunting at all, portraying somebody so universally well known?
Oh, terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. The most scared I've been of playing anything. The biggest of all, knowing that eventually I'd have to be sitting right here talking about it, and knowing the kind of scrutiny that something like this is going to come under, especially in Britain. I think we do have a great responsibility to living. When we look at living people's lives, we have an incredible responsibility to be truthful, and we're tipping dangerously into the world where we take living history and distort it for the sake of drama, which I think is dangerous, actually, because people do tend to look at film and think that that's truth. Of course it isn't. I'm like a portrait painter. It's my portrait, and it's infused with my sensibility and my thought and my imagination as much as the reality of what she is.
A funny, intimate and courageous queen who shall not be forgotten. The Queen, on screen.